the thing my therapist never did was say, you need to stop drinking. So she was like, you've done a masterful job at surviving. Alcohol has been one of your most effective tools. Would you like a set of new tools?
Hey y'all, what's going on? Welcome back to the Stacking Days podcast, where we highlight underrepresented journeys of sobriety. I'm really excited about today. I'm sitting down with Anne Skriba. She's a very talented individual and sounds like she's lived many lives by just having listened to her story on other platforms. And she reached out to Stacking Days to share her story, and I've apologized to her profusely up until this point, but it's taken us a little bit to get her on the show, but we finally have her here. Mm-hmm. So without further ado, Anne, welcome to Stacking Days.
Wow. Thank you so much, Ray. I've been listening for a while, ever since Chris and Tammy were on, and just a really big fan of what you're doing, and just, delighted to be here.
Thank you. I appreciate you listening, and I appreciate you contributing to the conversation, and looking forward to getting into your story today. So let's get into it from the top.
Okay.
Let's tell us a little bit about your origin story with alcohol. How did that relationship begin? And we'll just kind of take it from there.
Yeah, it started very early for me. So I grew up in the Midwest. I grew up in Wisconsin, to be exact. And so, to say that alcohol was a part of our lifestyle would be an understatement, probably the understatement of the century, especially at the time I was growing up in the 90s and early 2000s. I joke in other times I've told my story that, I had my first sip of alcohol when I was like a toddler, and it's kind of funny, but it's very, very true. So I was adopted, and my mom and her family, very rural Wisconsin, blue collar, grew up on a farm type. And so alcohol was just a part of it. It was the fabric that connected a lot of our family gatherings. Also, you think about like the social outings in Wisconsin, it's usually centered around a bar. It's usually centered around beer, the Packers, the Badgers. Like, it's just a communal aspect to growing up. And so, I got introduced to alcohol very early on. And I had my first drink, I think, when I was 12. And so it's something I saw my family do. And I think the tide is turning in this day and age, where we see a lot of, Holly Whitaker talks about it in her book, that alcohol is going to have its cigarette moment, where everyone's like, cigarettes bad. But when I grew up, alcohol was the cool thing to do. Everyone was trying to drink early. Everyone was trying to party. And so it just became as much of just a cultural part of my life as it did like a way to have fun, a way to relax, a way to let loose. So from a very early age, I saw it, I experienced it, and it was also very big in my family. So it just became part of the everyday, for me since, 12 until, just about, I think we're coming up on 20 months tomorrow. So,
congratulations.
It's just, thank you. It just really was a part of everything we did. And, it was, like I said, a centerpiece of almost everything that we did growing up.
Was alcohol, for most people, I feel like it's very much a part of everyday life. If not like directly, peripherally, for sure. Was it a problem in your family and in your social circles, or was it more just social and everyone kind of dabbled?
Yeah, no, it was definitely a both and. I had uncles and other people in my family that did struggle with it, that, however you want to categorize it, like you can't, tell anybody else what their degree of problem with alcohol was. But, and I also, had a parent directly who struggled with addiction when I was young. And so the impacts of that, I think, were way more lasting than even the social part of it, because it wasn't something that we could escape. It was very obvious when alcohol was present, and it was very obvious when alcohol made it difficult for my parent to be present and available. So as much as I was drawn to alcohol in that aspect, it really became something that I despised, in the sense that it just completely limited that one parent's ability to do what I needed, especially as a young person. You hear about attachment and these things. So it definitely was a both and. It was, definitely social, enjoyable, and then, it did have other, damaging impact as
Well,
well.
you mentioned I've heard on other platforms, and we talked a little bit about this before the show,
Hmm.
that you are adopted, correct?
Hmm.
What
Hmm.
age were you when you were adopted? Because the family that you're talking about right now is your adopted family, right?
Yeah,
For clarification. Okay.
correct. Yeah, correct. So my brother, I have a twin brother. We were adopted
Okay.
together, which is not very common. But as far as back as I can remember, I think we were maybe a matter of months
Gotcha.
old that when we were got adopted. So, I don't even necessarily in my mind distinguish adoptive mom or adoptive dad. Like that's
Sure.
just the family that I knew and I grew up with.
Sure.
So
Cool. Well, so what's the next chapter look like? So 12 years old, you have this first. Well, as a toddler,
yeah,
you have your first drink, and then 12 years
yeah,
old, you have the first drink. That's
yeah,
of real note. What does the next kind of 5, 10 years look like for you? Because I know that
yeah.
from hearing your story, there's a part of you that
Hmm.
was very, very laced up, very disciplined,
Yeah.
ultimately like a stellar athlete. And then,
Hmm.
and I've had conversations with other folks who were also athletes, and I by no means was a collegiate athlete, but I grew up playing sports, and it was
Hmm.
definitely also an outlet of mine. What did that
Yeah.
next chapter look like for you as you were trying to balance these two identities?
Yeah, and I think that's the best way to describe it, right? There was like a splitting, a definite, I think being an athlete, you learn so much of how to compartmentalize, because you have to. And so from probably, middle school, so if I had my first drink at 12, middle school, high school, and through college, definitely was living two separate lives. And I think this is where the ability to, really be functional. Like I would categorize my drinking as functional. I wasn't necessarily the one that was, way too out of bounds. Like even by the time, and I'm sure we'll get there in just a little bit, but by the time I decided to even question my relationship with alcohol, everyone in my life was like, but why? You're fine.
Yeah.
I was like the most functional person that they knew. So like they're like, oh, you don't have a problem, you're
Yeah.
good. So, on one hand, I was an athlete. I told my mom when I was 2 years old, I wanted to play college basketball and I wanted to play at Duke. And so from a very young age, I mean, I started lifting when I was 8. I started like a nutrition habit when I was young and, started going to the gym. Kobe Bryant is my favorite inspiration. You can see I have
Yeah.
the Mamba Forever shirt
I was
on.
gonna say, sounds like you
So
were an early adopter of the Mambo
yeah.
mentality.
Absolutely. Yeah. And still, to this day, I tend to get up between 4 and 6 a.m. on most days. It's just part of it. But, so you had that, student athlete vibe, trying to be the best that I can. And also, I'm the youngest of 7.
Oh
So I have
wow.
5 brothers and 1 sister.
Okay.
Yeah. So I apologize to my parents all the time. I'm like, I don't know how y'all did it. I ain't got no kids. So I'm like, I don't know how y'all did it. But, some of my other siblings did struggle with substance use in their high school years, and so I think I saw the way that it drew so much attention and sometimes negative attention away from me during my developmental years that I kind of went the other
Mm,
way. Whereas like if they're struggling, I'm going to be the best at everything. So I was a really good student, really good athlete, honed in very early on wanting to play in college and knew that it required discipline and sacrifice. So you have that on one side. And then the other side is where I went to high school and most of my formative years in Wisconsin, smaller town, but it was so interesting to be surrounded by people. I have one of my best friends that I talk to frequently, and she also has a similar background of very high achieving person, but also struggled with substance use in high school and beyond.
mm,
And she said, like, the way we grew up, like, trained us how to be
yeah.
functional. Because even in high school, we were going out, getting lit, doing that, but then we'd go to AP Lit and get an A on the test the very next
Yeah.
day. So I don't know how we were able to balance all that, but even at the time when I was in high school dabbling in drugs and alcohol, from the outside, no one would have thought that because all they saw was the student athlete and the hard worker and the high achiever. So from a very early on, I was kind of doing
Yeah.
both.
When I hear that, and I've talked to a fair amount of folks at this point, and even in my own story, I find that the high functioning, whatever you want to call it, alcoholic, substance abuse,
Yeah.
like that perpetuates a longer term relationship with the substance because the
Yeah.
wheels don't come
Yeah.
off as quickly as they do for others,
Yes.
right? So, I mean, so tell me about you moving towards that point where now you are starting to like maybe question your relationship with the substance. I know there's a lot
Yeah.
between the years of you
Yeah.
playing, the years of you being a
Mm-hmm.
coach. I want to talk about that, and
Yep.
then
Sure.
we'll go from there.
Yeah, yeah. So, like I said, all through high school was kind of doing both. But, basketball and the allure of a college scholarship was the one thing that really kept me from going off the deep
Yeah,
end. So there was times when cops would bust into a party and my friends would be like, "You got to
yeah,
go." Like I almost had, you hear about it in certain like NBA or some football players where even if you're in certain environments that are not the
yeah,
best, like there's kind of this communal guard. Like I had that. I don't know what that was, but so, but like there was just a certain line I was unwilling to cross because I had to protect, my
yeah,
future and going to college and all of that. So in college, it was a similar, but very different because college, everything, academics and certainly athletics is so different. So I think at that point, I was able to kind of put alcohol in the back seat, but it was still party, still drink. I definitely adopted this ability to drink regularly. So like, even if it was just a beer a night, like I was still drinking. And it became more of a way to deal with the pressures of being a high level college athlete. And so then after, I, wanted to get into coaching, which I had the opportunity to do. And so I got into coaching after that. And that I think is really kind of the delineation between kind of just we play hard, we party hard to like drinking became almost necessary to be able to withstand the travel, the pressure. Because as an athlete, you have a lot of control. If my jump shot is janky, I can go get in the gym and work on it. As a coach, so much of it is being able to relay passion and intention and discipline onto a group and not necessarily hope, but depend on them to be able to
yeah,
perform. So as a coach, the level of stress and scrutiny that you get is a lot more than even as a player. And so then you add in travel, long nights, recruiting was a huge part of it. So a lot of it just became to kind of just withstand the schedule. And so I'd say as I became a coach and a young adult is really when it became more necessary as a means to
hmm
function rather than just kind of a leisure activity slash maybe I'm drinking a little bit too much here and
no, that
there.
makes sense. When you were an athlete,
Hmm.
did you find that? I mean, obviously, you're able to moderate. You're managing your behavior a lot more, a
Yeah.
lot more tightly because of the light that you're under and the scope that that you're and the
Yeah.
platform that you're playing on. But did you find that maybe unhealthy behavior was maybe disregarded because you were performing on the
Mm.
court? Because there's two parts of
Yeah.
of this question. The
Yeah.
other part is when you became a coach, did you have players that maybe were also coping the way that you once did, and perhaps you turned a blind eye to kind of their activity because it was maybe just part of the culture? So I'm curious what that looked like for you from an athlete standpoint, and
Yeah.
then flipping it to being a coach.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's a great question. I definitely do think there is a double standard, and if you want to almost go quadruple standard, I think as a woman,
Mm,
as a female athlete, just because the way, well, it's changing now, but like especially when I was in college, like women's sports still kind of had this second class mentality to the men. So the disparity that I saw between the men's basketball team and what they would get
yeah,
into and how they would be disciplined versus us was very different. And I think when I was playing, our coaches were aware. They knew, obviously, that we were drinking, partying. And at the same time, if it didn't interfere with our ability to play, especially when you're dealing with college athletes, high school and younger is different, but these are
yeah,
adults, right? There's not necessarily like, you can't necessarily like monitor them 24/7. And so I think when I became a coach, I definitely saw similar things, and I think it did make it a little bit more difficult for me to even question or have that like authoritative curiosity with my players, because I knew, I mean, you schedule the hotel, you're going to make sure there's a bar
Yeah.
there, and you said to do the bed check and meet all the coaches at the bar at the end of the night. So, I think it was something that everyone was aware of. And I think, again, the compartmentalization factor became so prevalent both as a coach and an athlete. And as long as you were able to kind of, and especially, I mean, this is true, anybody who's an athlete knows this, you win, everything is really on the
Yeah.
table, right? If you're winning. And, at the last school that I was at, I don't necessarily want to give dates, or, I mean, people can look it up, Google it, but, we were very, very successful. So I think that also gave a little bit of a shield to what was going on, both with maybe our players, but especially with what we were doing as
Yeah.
coaches.
Yeah, cool. I appreciate that. Winning certainly is a license to move more freely than
Yeah.
not. That's for sure. So talk to me about the fork in the road. Talk to me about when you got
Mm,
to a place where it's like, okay, now I need to address this. It's been going on way too long now. It's clearly starting to
yeah.
become an issue for me. Not only am I starting to recognize this, perhaps folks from the
Yeah.
outside looking my way are starting to recognize it.
Hmm.
What did that shift look like for you?
Yeah, it definitely, was in, the period of 2020 to 2022-ish. So, I moved down here to Florida, at right before the summer of 2019. And so then I got a job where I could work remote. And, when you go from coaching, which is very strenuous, very, hectic, you're running all over the place, to have it a 9 to 5, it felt like stability. It felt like a little bit more security financially. And so I was young and I was like, oh, I just go to the bar, I just go have happy hour, just go do that. But you move into 2020 with the pandemic, and now we have to be at home. And you make all these promises to yourself, like, oh, I would never drink from home, I would never work and drink at the same time. Like, no one does
Yeah.
that. Well, you start, like, breaking all these promises to yourself. So I started, like, I think it wasn't I don't know if there was like a major like tipping point, but there was a series of, things that started to stack up, pun intended, I
Yeah.
guess. But, the first thing is like, I remember, and you got to remember, I'm in Florida. So reckless down here with COVID and everything.
Yeah.
I know I
It
have
didn't
friends
even
back
exist.
home. No, it was, I had friends back home in Minnesota, and, I remember, we shut down for maybe 3.5 weeks, maybe, and so they were like, I was like, yeah, I went out to get a drink, and they're like, you can go out. I'm like, yeah, it's Florida.
It's
No
wild.
one cares about our safety. But when everything was shut down, I still found myself figuring out a way to go get drinks I gotta have drinks in the house. I gotta have drinks around, and so it was just like those little exceptions that started to stack up. I was living with family for the first year and a half that I was here. So it was a little bit, more difficult because they were kind of always seeing what I was doing. But once I moved out on my own, then kind of the guards were
Yeah.
off. And so then I started to really see how much of a daily thing it was. Um, and then, 2020, with the rise of the violence against people that look like us and Black Lives Matter, like it really just started to, I think it was a confluence of things. Kobe died. We should have all knew, like, we're in, like, buckle up after that's how it started
Hmm.
in January, right? But that really impacted me. And so I really started to see that, like, I think we were talking about this right before we recorded, but alcohol was the way that I was dealing with everything. People often associate it as a celebratory, exciting way to just be around community. Well, if I had a good day at work, I was drinking. If I had a bad day at work, I was drinking. If I played well, I was drinking. If I didn't play well, I was drinking. So it was way more of a response to every emotion that I had. And so that was a little bit alarming. And yet, no one was saying anything. People in my life were like, you're cool, you're good. And I think I hit a really low point during that season where I just remember talking to, close friends and family and just saying, like, I need a shot of tequila to even get up to sign into
Mm.
work. And we're having a shot of tequila at 7 a.m. just to even just like open that computer up and be like, okay, we'll do this
Yeah.
job. And I was doing sales at the time, and that was a lot of pressure and anxiety inducing as well. So that and then, I had a conversation with my mom too, and she had at that point initially said, you need to talk to somebody, which at that point, I was very averse to any sort of like therapy or anything like that. But it was interesting because I think for the first time, I often have represented in my life, people would come to me for motivation or, how do I get in shape or how do I get, and so people would come to me looking for inspiration of
Mhm.
sorts. And when I had nothing to give people and people literally were like, and oftentimes people didn't know what to say to me because they were like, well, you got it. You're a coach, you're this, you're an athlete, you can bounce back. And when the people in my life were like, seeing that I didn't have any sort of joy or happiness or ability to bounce back was really the thing. And I think I made that initial appointment to see my therapist, who I still see to this day, after that conversation with my mom, where she really, really urged me to seek some additional help.
Yeah. Hey guys, I hope you're enjoying the episode. If you are, we'd really love it if you could leave us a rating and a review on Apple Podcast or a rating on Spotify. And of course, please feel free to invite somebody into the conversation. If you feel like you have a story to share on the podcast, why not apply to be a guest? You can do so by completing the form on the podcast description or find it on stackanddays.com. That's stackndayys.com. But for now, let's jump back into the conversation. I resonate with that period of time and how you attempted to navigate that period pretty closely. I feel like we don't talk about it enough. I mean, you hear that all the time. We don't talk about this enough. It's not a conversation that's being had enough. But I feel like that window of time, there was a collective trauma on so many levels, right? Like I feel like there's, in broader America, the global, community, obviously we're dealing with COVID, right? But I think that something that a lot of communities outside of folks who identify as being people of color don't get is that George Floyd and everything that was happening around that time, and we didn't have anywhere to go. We couldn't touch anybody to deal with that type of stuff. And I mean, it's not like it started with George Floyd, and it certainly hasn't ended with him, right? Like even, last week we see a brother who got choked out at that hotel, and it's like, how do you medicate for that? You know what I mean? Where do you go for that when you're the one who's expected to be the strong one? And I feel like we're going to be healing from that period of time for quite some time. And I am glad that some folks have been able to find sobriety and heal that way. But I know for others, it hasn't worked out that way, and they've almost gone, further into the shadows, so to speak. So I just want to continue to highlight on this show that's a pivotal moment in our contemporary history in terms of pain. That folks of color experience. And, so I appreciate you calling that out. And Kobe was a part of that. Like, we have these figures that we look to as a culture to be like, he's a beacon, he's an example of X, and, his daughter, just, taken out, like a candle being blown out. So, 2020 was a rough one. And I've had my own version of that. So I'm glad that you got to a place where you sought help. The therapist that you ultimately turned to, was that a therapist that you had already been maybe working with, or you just said like, look, I got to find something here. It's way too much for me to deal with on my own?
Yeah, no, I had not been working with her. Before I hop into talking about my therapist, who I love very dearly, but the other thing too that I think is important to know about that period of time, and really almost any period of time for people of color, is like, I think one of the more maddening things about that is, again, the world is shut down. We're still expected to work, and yet I can't call into. I was so sickened that, especially because I went to college in Minnesota. I went to college in Minneapolis in the Twin Cities. Yep. So where that Cup Foods was, I've been there, and I know those areas where George Floyd was. So it felt and I had so many friends who were in the protests and, being assaulted by the police. It was too much. And yet I am so expected to sign in to work. I can't call my boss and be like, I'm Black, I don't want to go to work today. Do you see the news? And I think that was an exacerbation of the the isolation and just the confinement of that time, because there, like you said, there really was nowhere to go. Where do we go? Who do we talk to? And if you're working for a company in the US, you're probably working for a majority white group of people that, they don't have to worry about these things on a different
Yeah.
level. And so there was just not that much attention to it. And, 4 years later, we get Juneteenth off. That's great. And yet it doesn't account for just the grind that it was to even show up to work during that
Yeah.
time.
I mean, unfortunate but not surprising, right? Like I feel like we're you know
Yeah.
we're in a country that for all intents and purposes is has been built on the pain of people of color, so it's not surprising, but I do think that at least we're in a time where it's much more it's glaring and people
Yeah.
can't act as though that it's not the case anymore.
Yeah.
So I think that's a good note. So thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. No. So yeah, back to my therapist, who I love to talk
Therapy,
about.
we all need it.
Um, yeah, we do. We do. It's been one of the most um helpful, encouraging, enjoyable experiences. And I know that's not everybody's story, and I find myself lucky in this regard. So this was a complete match. So, oftentimes you sign up for therapy, there's a matching team that looks at your profile, what you fill in, and it clicked. And it clicked from the very first session. Not to say like I was spilling my guts to her, but there was some things that we connected on very early, and I actually canceled my first appointment. So I said it, and then I was like, I'm not
Yeah.
going. And so then a couple weeks later, I was like, okay, I want to come back. And so gave it a shot, walked in there, very terrified. I think one of the things that will always stick out to me in this, so I'm a very sarcastic person. I appreciate sarcasm. I know it's like a dying language in today's age. I don't know if like Gen Z, or even when I was
It's because
coaching
nobody
my
wants to be
last couple
offended anymore.
years.
You know.
That's true. That's true. So it's, yeah, you gotta know your audience with that one. I just remember there was a question on there about like suicidality,
Mm.
and it was like, are you having suicidal thoughts? And I put yes and no, and I just remember my therapist being like, that makes a lot of sense to me, because a lot of times people are very afraid of that, which is not to make light of it, but just that it's on a spectrum,
Yeah.
right? And so just her ability to kind of suss out the fact that, like, it's not like she needed to call and put me in grippy socks, but also that she could see that I was in a lot of pain, and was seeking a lot of
Yeah.
help. So
So do you look at therapy as kind of being the cornerstone of a lot
I
of your
do.
work, and how did it serve as such? And then what did you do to kind of
Yeah.
layer on top of the therapy to give yourself some
Yeah.
success in those early days?
Yeah, yeah. So I want to definitely say that therapy was the cornerstone of a lot of my healing, and continues to be, and certainly the cornerstone of my
Yep.
sobriety. I did not go into therapy to try to stop drinking. That was not it. I didn't even become sober curious until about 9 months after initially
Mm.
starting therapy. So, obviously we got into family history. I talked about my family, my parents' struggles with it. And so there was always this, you know, ability to talk about it, but a lot of times it was too painful at the beginning to really dive into it as a problem that I had. So we could talk about it generally, but I never was like, I need help. And so the curiosity that my therapist showed, and the willingness to never tell me what to do, but to always ask really good questions. She would always ask really great questions. That eventually, like, this is the thing too. It's like, I went back after I was probably maybe, I don't know, 8 months sober. I used to watch the show Intervention all the
Yeah.
time, if you ever
I
saw
have
it.
seen
And I
probably
am
every
just
episode
like,
I've probably seen.
I am like in shock now. I'm like, I can't believe, I mean, I can believe that it was a show because people are desperately wanting their family members to be better. The thing my therapist never did was say, you need to stop drinking.
Mm.
She, she gave me an analogy as we were working through it. She said, I'll never forget it. And it's, every time I tell my story, I do want to bring this in. But she said, you've done a masterful job of surviving. And I look at alcohol as a way that I
Hmm.
survived. Me personally, I don't demonize it. I think if you look at it objectively, there's no redeeming qualities about alcohol itself, but it provided a lot of ability for me to
Yep.
survive. So she was like, you've done a masterful job at surviving. Alcohol has been one of your most effective tools. Would you like a set of new tools?
Mm.
And so it was just really helpful to realize that she wasn't like, you need to stop drinking. She just asked, like, is this the most effective tool in your toolbox? And I had to sit with that and be like, no, because it's not allowing me to do the things I want to do and feel the way that I want to feel. So there was a long period of being sober curious, starting to listen to the podcast. I read Quit Like a Woman. It was so encouraging. And I read it, all of it in a bar. It became its own like harm reduction because I was like sit down with a beer or two, and then by the end of the book I was like, I don't think I'm gonna go get another one. I think I'm
I
just
love
gonna
that.
finish reading the book. And so then after that, she had encouraged me, my therapist had encouraged me. She's like, can you just try? Can we just give it a couple days? Because I mean, I was drinking, and she also did ask, and it was one of the most scary propositions I had ever had. But she's like, can you just track your drinks for a week?
Mm.
And I'm like, you don't want me to do that. Like, you really don't want. She's like, no, like, no judgment. There was never any judgment, no shame, no any of that. She just is like, if we're going to try to get a baseline, like, we got to understand what we're dealing with. And so after doing that, that was really like a whoa
Mm.
moment. Cause I thought, I mean, tolerance is different for everybody. It just was very glaring to me how much
Because
I
you're,
was able to
it's just,
drink.
just the sheer volume. You were just like, I've never
Yeah,
had to come face to face with this. Yeah.
no. Yeah, no. And then, it's like my lifestyle was very similar. I was still working out, still playing, so I still play pickup basketball about 6 times a week. So I was still doing that. I don't know how I was doing that, but yeah, that was the first time that I had to really look at it on paper as like cold, hard numbers. And especially being a coach, I mean, it essentially was like watching
Yeah.
film of a bad
Yeah.
game. And you're just like, oh, okay. So I had to look at that. And so she was like, what's the longest you've ever gone without drinking? And I was like, a day. And she's like, okay, can you try 2? And me being the overachiever, I was like, I'll do 4. And so I did 4, just to kind of be
Yeah.
annoying and be an overachiever. And haven't had a drink since.
Wow. Congratulations on
Thank
getting
you.
to this place. I got a lot of questions,
Yeah.
and I first of all, what a fantastic invitation by way of your therapist in saying, "Would you like a new set of
Yeah.
tools?" I feel like sometimes that can be such a preventative like hurdle for folks moving into a new direction, is because they just don't know what the hell to do, right? Like I think getting
Yeah.
that degree of like hope can give you the just the wherewithal, and I feel like the momentum that you need to get 4 days, right? Because you're like, look,
Yeah.
I have someone here who's holding my hand on this. I think it's really important, and I've had my own experience with therapeutic support in my journey, and I think it's been integral, not just from the standpoint of abstaining from alcohol, but more
Yeah.
specifically on kind of going back in and trying to understand more about myself, so that I'm living more intentionally, not just today, but tomorrow. So,
Right.
hats off to you on that. Which leads me to my question: what?
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like you've probably done this work, because it sounds like you have with your therapist. But where did you land on what your why was? Right? Like
Mm.
what was the crux behind the substance for you, as you started to do a lot more self-evaluation and work on yourself?
Yeah, so I mean, so much of the process, even before, those 4 days, was diving into trauma and diving into, the ways that I was able to show up and why, what was I seeking with all the behaviors I was doing. I think ultimately the why is that, Laura McCowan, who's written a couple books and she obviously founded TLC, she says, the question is not, are you drinking too much or are you not, or, this or that. It's, are you free? And I wouldn't say I posed it that way, but definitely I had to answer the question, like, is alcohol serving
Yeah.
me? And I started to get curious and excited almost too about, and I think it really became, or it came from a lens of an athlete, because I thought about it and I just was like, man, I go play basketball at 4 in the morning. I still do my workouts, but how much more could I get out of it? Like, how much better could I feel doing the things that I love to do, if alcohol wasn't a part of it? And I also just really wanted the challenge of recognizing that I could live life, fully aware.
Hmm.
I think I was so just in a haze for so many years. So it was a little bit of a challenge. I definitely, think that the Kobe Bryant mindset, the Mamba mentality, which me and my therapist, we draw upon a lot, in my, challenging aspects, but also just recognizing that, again, I think she called me into a vision of what life would look like, not just surviving. And I think a lot of times as people of color, especially like I used to, no longer, but I used to really wear that moniker of strong, independent Black woman. Like, I'm good. I don't need anybody. And so she almost invited me into like taking that off too, of like, you can live this way, but you can find so much more joy, intimacy, fulfillment, and ease. Like, I think for a lot of us people of color, like life is not easy. And it's not to say that getting sober or being sober or doing the work of healing is easy. It just means we don't have to struggle all the
Yeah.
time, self-inflicted.
Yeah.
More so. So I think it was a combination of those things, but really at the crux of it was I had to ask, was alcohol serving me? And my answer was no.
No, no. Appreciate that. I think that's important to note. I mean, in asking those questions and being honest with yourself, in the response to those questions and then acting on that response, I think is key. You alluded to kind of like the athlete's mindset, and when I think about
Mm-hmm.
athlete, I think about. I mean, I think Kobe is like on like probably the extreme, right?
Yeah.
With Mamba mentality.
Yeah.
When you think about like the word discipline, right? Like I feel
Mm-hmm.
my question for you is, did your definition of discipline soften, change over the course of like your recovery? Because there can be a
Yeah.
very stringent perspective on what like discipline is,
Yeah.
right? And then I feel like once you get into this space of development, certainly when you're looking to develop from a substance, you almost have to blow a lot of shit up, right? To
Yeah.
like to
Yeah.
figure it out, right?
Yeah.
So like, did your perspective on discipline shapeshift as you were on that journey?
100,000%. I used to be very much like, you have to do the things, you have to do them exactly right. Precision was the name of the game. And I often associated discipline, with, a sense of disappointment
Mm,
or defeat, or it feeling punitive in a way. Like you often hear like people say like, I need to eat, I'm not in shape, I need to go work out. Like that doesn't sound
yeah,
enjoyable. So I think because even before those 4 days, again, it was an 8-month process of even considering letting go of
yeah,
alcohol. And one of the things my therapist did, and it might be controversial to some, but for me, it was so helpful in letting me decide how I wanted this to play out. But we did a whole full court, 3/4 court press of harm reduction. Everything from, she's like, if you're gonna go out and drink at home. If you are gonna go out and drink, get an Uber. Like I bought $100 Lyft gift card just to make sure I never got behind the wheel of a car drunk again, and called in a lot of additional support. So the drinking lessened over time, but it really wasn't this one and done type of thing. And I think at the crux of it was a curiosity and a approach that was so filled with grace that I got to let go of, like you said earlier, like the white knuckling approach. I have a very like fluid, flexible, slow paced approach to growth and development now that I didn't have before. And that a lot of progress in the journey is buffeted by joy and
mm,
grace. And so as an athlete before, I was going to be in the gym until I made 500 shots. And now I care more about how I'm shooting rather than how many I make, if that makes
yeah.
sense.
I love that. They always talk about fundamentals, right? Like feels like you're
Yeah.
trying to redefine what those fundamentals look like so
Yeah.
that you increase your success rate of doing the things that you
Hmm.
want to do, right? I love
Yeah.
that. Um, we're gonna wrap up soon, but I do have
Sure.
one more question in terms that
Yeah.
talks that speaks more to like the culture of athleticism, because you obviously
Hmm.
played at a high level. Um, I feel like that's like alcohol abuse is something that you oftentimes don't ever hear about until folks retire from their
Yeah.
sports,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
We see it in professional football, we've seen it in professional basketball, more so on this on in men's sports than even in women's
Hmm.
sports. Um, what do you think that there is to that? Why is there so much stigma and silence around abuse of substances within the world of athletics when we talk so much about performance enhancing substances, but we don't talk about
Yeah.
performance, deduction substances that that are probably even more harming to the younger generations that we're trying to
Yeah.
protect. So I'm curious what your perspective is on that culture, and what do you think we need to be doing differently?
Yeah, I mean, I think it starts with the fact that, at least from my perspective, I can only speak to my experience, but me reaching for alcohol or substances was never about anything but coping. Like, I think so many athletes are coping with the pressure, the stress, the anxiety to perform. And also, it's probably like a little bit of a dichotomy there, right? Because as an athlete, like our body is our
Yep.
temple, but how many fitness things do you see, see people running a marathon and there's beer at the end and, it's, almost like every, pro athlete has like a liquor line. Like, I just think it's just part of it. And I think a big reason why it's so acceptable is because athletes do a great job of
Mm.
compartmentalizing and they're able to function. And especially if you get to the highest levels of sport, like, no one really cares what you're doing outside of it. They just want to make sure you can show up and play. So I think that is a part of like why it's so rampant and prevalent as far as like how we need to break into it, and try to like set a different trajectory. I mean, I can only say that I think it's addressing those things more than the drink. Like, again, for me, I've never had this approach of demonizing alcohol and thinking it's like this evil, horrible thing that everybody needs to not do. I think we need to be more curious as to why people are reaching for it, right? Gabor Mate said, if you encounter somebody with addiction or struggle with abuse of substances, you don't ask why the addiction, you ask why the
Yeah.
pain. And I think a lot of athletes are struggling with pain behind closed doors, but they also are having access to a lot of lifestyles that every average person wants to
Yeah.
have. And so I think a lot of times athletes' actual lived experiences are cast aside because they have money and
Yeah.
fame.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I do agree with you in terms of like looking at the pain, and I think that we've seen time and time again, even when it comes to athletes at the highest level who have massive platforms, they seem to societally only have a license to speak about certain things and to address
Yeah,
certain matters of subject. I mean, you look at everyone from look at Naomi Osaka having to like pull out
yeah,
for mental health issues and being demonized for that, or look at LeBron James taking a stance on civil issues and being demonized for that.
yeah,
And it's interesting because if you look at the highest level of sports, most of those folks are people of color, right? And I don't think
yeah.
that we've been given the grace even at higher levels of society where we can have honest conversations about what's really plaguing us. And again, whether it's societally or individually, alcohol is and the abuse of it or any other substance is really just a symptom of something much larger, right?
Hmm.
So I think
Yeah.
that's a super poignant note. So thank you for that. Last two questions, and then we'll
Okay.
get you going. I asked basically everybody this. So one is a softball, one is a little bit more of a fastball, to use a sports
Okay.
terminology. I'll give you the fastball first.
Okay.
In your kind of darkest days when you were really, really struggling, how
Yeah.
would someone would have known that you were struggling if you didn't tell them explicitly?
Yeah, and I was not one who would tell them explicitly for sure. I wanted to put on this face of I got it, even then when I don't. But I think that one of the most telltale signs that someone is struggling is look at their life and the things that bring them joy and if those things are absent. So there was a period during my darkest time where I was not at the gym for about 2 months. And one of my guys that I play pickup with, actually, hit me up and was like, I ain't seen you. Like, where are you at? And so that was one of the moments where, was able to break through, and, we met, and, he's like, you don't look good, and we haven't seen you. And so when you start losing interest in the things that typically are a resource, that's usually a telltale sign. At least for me, that was the biggest thing.
Well, shout out to that teammate of yours, and also shout out to your mom too. I feel like her reaching out to you and just being like, "Hey, sweetheart, you gotta, let's take an honest look here." I think that sounds like that was a pivotal moment for you as well.
Yeah.
Last question, for someone who's listening to the show and they're kind of at that point in their life where they're trying to, address, their issue, their problem that they've identified for themselves, but they don't know what that first step could look like. What would you suggest to them?
Yeah. I mean, I think that we all have somebody, that cares about us. So like I said, like either whether it was that conversation with my mom, I also had a really dear coworker who, also, actually after I canceled that first appointment, she was the one like, nah, you're going to go this time. Cause we were still working, still doing our thing. And she could just see the toll that everything was taking on me. So, I don't think you have to start with a large group or even a therapist. It's intimidating for a lot of people. I think just having an honest conversation with one person in your life can really start building a bridge to the place you want to be.
I love that. It's trying to find spaces of non-judgment, I feel like are important. Well, I want to get you going here. Can you tell us a little bit about Clean Play, the podcast?
Yeah, absolutely.
And for those who don't know, Anne co-hosts this cool podcast with Chris Marshall, who was on Stacking Days and shared his story on episode 33. But tell us a little bit about how that came together.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I had reached out to you way before Clean Play ever really came into fruition. And you, like, reaching out to you was really like putting myself out there, right? I always had a desire to be on a podcast or start one. But, Chris and I, so Chris is part of the Luckiest Club, which is the sobriety support community I'm also a part of. We met in BIPOC space there. So we always connected really, really well. And oftentimes when I would share in these sobriety support meetings, whether or not, a lot of the people in the meeting were of sports mind, I just always found that speaking through sports analogies really made a lot of sense to me. And then I could really see that it started to resonate with other people when I would share. And so he said at one point, he's like, we got to do a podcast. It's just like, awesome. Okay. And then we did it. And so it's called the Clean Play Podcast. It's with me and Chris. And obviously Chris has a long sports fandom, history, and obviously really huge in the non-alcoholic beverage space world. And so we just decided to do it. It's funny because your very first episode, I didn't know if we were doing like a meeting on the podcast or we were actually doing it.
Yeah.
But we show up and start recording, and it's really all about the intersection of sobriety and sports, whether you're a sports fan, whether you're an athlete, even if you're not, it's just really about tying those two worlds together to kind of give each one language for the other. So it's been a lot of fun. I think we got maybe like 12 episodes out for now, and we're going to keep going with it.
That's awesome. It's a great project. I mean, certainly, by way of this conversation, it's definitely like a broader conversation that needs to be had, right? Like the world of sports and sobriety and the implications of that. And Chris is fantastic. I think he's a great guy.
Yeah. Shout out to Chris.
Yeah. Shout out to Chris. Where can folks find you, Anne?
Yeah, I am not super big on social media. That might have to change in the coming months just to make sure I'm kind of up to date. But I do have Instagram. It's just my last name and then 05. That's it. That's really the only one I'm on. I don't really do Facebook, and I might get a TikTok one day, but we'll see.
I mean, it's all good. I mean, I was checking out your Instagram, and if nothing else, I love watching people play pickup basketball, and you got quite a bit of that on there. So, and I really do appreciate you joining the show. Thank you for coming on and sharing your story. I'm sure that we'll stay in contact, and really, really thank you for coming on.
No, thank you so much.
You got it. I appreciate you guys listening to the Stacking Days podcast. I hope this episode added value to your recovery and wellness journey. Before we go our separate ways, let's connect on social. You can find us on TikTok and Instagram at Stacking Days or via the website www.stackingdays.com. By supporting the show, you can play a direct role in amplifying people of color in their pursuit of recovery. The easiest way to do that is to subscribe or hit the follow button. This way you'll never miss an episode, all while playing an active part in creating the ecosystem where diverse voices in healing matter. This show is for the purpose of education and connection and is not a replacement for therapy or recovery care. For more information on the resources and support available, take a look at SAMHSA and some other resources shared in the description. Until we meet again, be well, one day at a time.